President Donald Trump wants the war in Ukraine to end. He'd promised to end it within 24 hours. That hasn't happened, but he did say this.
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal.
And later, he threatened Russia with additional sanctions if it didn't come to the negotiating table. So, will Russia want to make a deal in the first place? And what deal would Trump like to see? It's part of what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome.
And I'm Melissa Chan. I'll be looking at the questions you guys post in the chat and bringing them into the discussion. And to help us have that discussion, we have, of course, around the table, Alex Forrest-Whiting, who will be bringing us up to date on what's happening with the war. And we have our special guest, Tyson Barker, just a few days out from the Biden administration. He served in that administration, working to help Ukraine in terms of planning its recovery. Eventually. And opposite me is Jared Reed, who will also be looking at the chat and also looking at your comments and questions. So between the two of us, hopefully, we'll be able to bring in your questions. And speaking of that, I just want to share a few things from the folks out on the interwebs. Just a few comments from Steffi Ganda, 9798, quote, Trump wants peace, but also wants to invade countries. Greenland, Panama, and Canada are waiting to be invaded, with the emoji with the laughing and crying face. Another one from Trafor. I trust Trump to make the best decision and not wait, as the EU did, except for the Baltic states and Poland to make decisions. Too many backseat drivers who don't know what to do making comments. And then the last one is scot-free. I'd like to know what Musk has to say. Better to hear from the puppet master than from the puppet. So we have some strong comments from folks. Keep them coming. And of course, come with your questions as well, because we have someone who spent a lot of time in D.C. In the last administration. So this is a very, special opportunity for you guys to ask him questions directly.
And those questions you'll be posting in the chat, which, of course, Jared will also be monitoring. But that's not the only thing you'll be monitoring, Jared, because like every time, nearly every time, 99% of the time, 99% of the time, we have a poll question. And today's poll question is...
what's the likely outcome of a Trump-negotiated plan for Ukraine? And we have 4 options for you to choose from, so please do get your votes in. Number 1, a complete end to the conflict. Number 2, a temporary ceasefire. Number 3, no meaningful progress. And number 4, an escalation. So whatever you think the likely outcome of a Trump-negotiated plan for Ukraine is, please do let us know in our poll.
And you'll be able to see this poll in the chat on your devices. We shall have the results towards the end of the discussion, which we don't know when that's going to be. So just stay along and listen in. But before we move on, I just wanted to sort of bring Tyson in, because he has made the long transatlantic journey to get back to Berlin.
Just to be with you.
Welcome back. Welcome back to DW. We love having you on. Just as an opening general question, as a general comment for you, you worked with the Biden administration. Do you think the Biden administration has been able to leave Ukraine in a strong position, not just for the war, but also for the next administration?
I think before you dive into that, what was your official formal title? Just so
Sure. It's a very long title, which is probably a sign of how little power I actually had. But I was the Deputy Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery. I was the Deputy First to Secretary Penny Pritzker, and then Deputy Secretary of State Richard Verma, our former ambassador to India. And what we were responsible for was, what will Ukraine look like? What will recovery and reconstruction look like concurrent to the war and after the war? And what we discovered, to our surprise and happiness is how much economic dynamism is taking place in Ukraine right now. The country is a massive and growing defense industrial base, is creating the world's most innovative drones, cybersecurity, counterintelligence technology that will be powering NATO and democracies around the world in the future after this war is over. And frankly, taking defense munitions market share from Russia itself, which used to be a major defense exporter. We also worked a lot on helping Ukraine to reopen the Black Sea export corridor. I think everybody knows that Ukraine is one of the world's bread baskets, exporting millions, hundreds of millions of tons of grain and sunflower oil to the world, feeding hundreds of millions of people in the global south. And frankly, even as this war is going on right now, is exporting grain to Syria to feed people there as we speak. We were working on a lot of these things, making sure that Ukraine had the macroeconomic lifeline it needed to make sure hospitals could stay open, kids could go to school, first responders were getting paid, all these things. So there's a lot of activity on that economic front that the U.S. and the EU are supporting. If you ask me to render a judgment on the Biden administration, I would say, we could only do as much as the Ukrainians were asking us to do on both fronts. They were the ones setting the plan, but there are a number of successes. If you looked from 2022 to today, and I think President Trump made allusion to this, everybody expected Kyiv to fall within a week. By this time, Ukraine has taken back over 50% of the territory that Russia initially occupied. It has pushed Russia out of the Black Sea so that those port routes are open. It has been attacking Crimea so that Crimea can't be used as a launch pad for attacks into Ukraine. And it has incurred into Russian territory itself, occupying the territory of Kursk. So this...
It's a very, very small incursion.
It's a very small incursion, that's true, but we're talking about David versus Goliath here. Right. And let's be honest, in every metric, Ukraine has really beaten the odds.
And we will look at all of that on the map as well. And that's where you come in, Alex, because you can provide us a bit of a context and bring us up to speed with what's been happening, especially on the policy front in the past few days. A very eventful 48 hours we've had, haven't we?
We have. And let's just start with Volodymyr Zelensky himself. That's the Ukrainian president, which I'm sure everybody knows already. He spoke at the World Economic Forum at Davos just yesterday, so that's Tuesday, and he used his platform really to talk very directly to Europe. In particular, he called on them to establish become a much stronger global player, and went as far as to suggest that Europe has less influence over Washington because the US doesn't think it contributes enough in terms of security. So let's just have a listen to what he said on Tuesday.
In times of war, everyone worries, will the United States stay with them? And every ally worry about that. But does anyone in the United States worry that Europe might abandon them someday, might stop being their ally? The answer is no. Washington does not believe Europe can bring them something that is really substantial. Only real security guarantees for us will serve as real security guarantees for everyone in Europe.
So that was Zelensky there talking about, obviously, those security guarantees, but also really turning up the heat on Europe. The biggest question, though, of course, is what will the Trump administration do over the war in Ukraine? We know, as you've just alluded to, that Donald Trump wanted to end this war very, very quickly. The problem is we don't really know what the US plan is at the moment. There seem to be some very key players involved in this. So very briefly, I'm going to just whip through some of these key players, and we can see the photos if we can just share my screen. This is Keith Kellogg, who you will be able to see in a moment. He is Trump's Ukraine and Russia envoy and the man that Trump has designated to end the war. He's a retired lieutenant general and a member of Trump's National Security Council. He's actually blamed Biden in the past for escalating, what he says, escalating the conflict by trying to bring Ukraine closer to the West and isolating Russia. He came up with a plan at the end of last year about some possible solutions. He wants a negotiated settlement to end the war, which would see Ukraine surrender its territories that are currently under Russian occupation in exchange for security guarantees and relief payments to help build it. But he's made it very clear that he wants to make sure that Ukraine's ambitions for NATO membership are put on hold. So that is very key and a difficult one for Ukraine.
Just a quick clarification, security guarantees, these are US security guarantees, correct?
Correct, US security guarantees. Let me just click now to the next player. Now, this is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He has described the war as a complex conflict. He is actually somebody who, in Congress last year, voted against Biden's plans to offer more military aid, so just important to point out. He's talked in the past about a negotiated settlement as well. It's a stalemate war, he said. And just one thing to add is that he is a China hawk. And I say that because so is this next person. That is Mike Waltz, who is Trump's new national security advisor. Now, in the past, he called on Biden to give more weapons to Ukraine. He now seems to have done an about turn, basically asking, is it in America's interest to help Ukraine at all, to focus so many resources on Ukraine? And three more very quickly. J.D. Vance, many of you will recognise him. He, of course, is the new vice president. He is definitely a Ukraine skeptic, as is Tucker Carlson, who is Trump's press secretary, former Fox News presenter and obviously a conservative. And just this last person that we thought was important to throw in from a German perspective, this is Richard Grenell, Trump's presidential envoy for special missions. He used to be Trump's former intelligence chief, but he was also US ambassador to Germany under Trump's first presidency. And he has made it very clear that Ukraine should not join NATO. So, yes.
I just wanted to check, did you misspeak about Tucker Carlson being Trump's former
Sorry, no, that he is
was not. Yeah, he never was, yeah.
No, but he's working in the administration now. Is that
informally?
I think informally, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they talk a lot.
They talk every day. And he has some kind of
right texting and stuff like that.
Apologies if I misspoke that.
Yeah.
Okay, and just very quickly, so we know that there are these big players involved in this, talking to Trump, have obviously. Some of them have got different views on where this is going, which is why it's just important to say it. These aren't even all the players, by the way. There are others as well that I haven't had a chance to mention.
Like Elon Musk.
Like Elon Musk, exactly. So Elon Musk
Who's
being
now going to be heading up a government department, so maybe his word will carry even more weight. Who knows? But this is just yeah.
And then just very briefly, we are about to enter the fourth year of this war.
Yep.
It's still, you know, we know it's become a drone war. We just talked about that, and you were talking about the success of Ukraine on this. For example, this week, Ukraine carried out a series of drone strikes against Russian oil refineries. And Russian forces, of course, continuing their slow, grinding march across Ukraine and do appear to be gaining ground. So that is where we are at the moment, without me going into any details about the front line.
Those details we will enter into with an expert, but just so that you guys listening in, everything that Alex was saying there, we're going to pick up on again, especially when it comes to security guarantees. What is the Trump administration's plans on Ukraine, or the various plans or the thoughts that exist over there. We'll also talk about President Zelensky's victory plan. But that's coming up in just a minute. But let's just bring you up to speed with where the front lines, where the battle lines are. And to do that, we are joined now on the line by Marina Miron from King's College London. Marina, if you all are regular viewers of DW News, you would have seen talking about Ukraine quite a bit in the past 3 years. Marina, welcome. Thanks for joining us. If I can just ask you at the very outset, and before we bring on maps and you can talk us through what's happening there, have we seen anything unusual, would you say, on the battlefield since Donald Trump officially became president?
Hi, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, in terms of unusual, I wouldn't say that we are seeing anything unusual. We're seeing that the Russian forces are trying to accelerate their offensives in the Donbass. We're also seeing a bit of movement across the Sumy region from the Russian territory. And of course, the Ukrainian forces are trying not only to gain more traction in the Kursk region, but they're also trying long-range strikes to strike the Russians in the rear, in the Russian-controlled territories in Ukraine, as well as in Russia proper, as has been just mentioned, with oil depots and refineries. So it seems like it is continuing just like before Donald Trump entered the Oval Office.
Okay, you know what? Let's just bring up a map so that people can follow along. And I'm guessing you can see us, so hopefully you'll be able to see this map as well. So Alex has very kindly pulled up this map, and whatever is shaded, what color is that, pink?
Yeah, so the pink is the Russian advances, and if we go in closer, you can see different colours such as yellow, claimed Russian advances, and then on the left here, this is obviously Ukraine.
Unoccupied
Maps
Ukraine.
in the chat now too.
Brilliant. Mariana, can we maybe just zoom out on the map? If we are to look at what is happening on the ground now, where on this map should we be looking? Because that's a very long frontier. Where would you ask all those people in the chat to look at as to what is happening particularly?
Well, I would look at the Donetsk region, also at the upper, the yellow bits, which are the claimed Russian advances. So we would go through around Pokrovsk. Then we have the Toretsk, Chasiv Yar direction. Unfortunately, I cannot read because I'm sitting too far from the screen.
We're zooming in.
We are zooming in.
We're
So I'm just
zooming
trying
in.
to find
Yeah, so
some of
we should have Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar we had just up north.
I think it's further up, right?
Yeah.
Then we have Toretsk to the south. So maybe just a few words about Chasiv Yar.
So
go on. I think that's
let me just highlight that. That is just there is one of the places, Chasiv Yar, just there with my blue, if that's easier for people to see.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And so the Russians are coming from the northern and eastern part of Chasiv Yar and trying to take the settlement. And that has been a very difficult one for the Russians because of the terrain of Chasiv Yar. And we now see that they have changed their approach. But here we actually see them going literally street by street, which is a little bit reminiscent of what the Wagner group did in Bakhmut. And so this is an interesting location because that would open up the way to Slaviansk and Kramatorsk, which is to the northwest of Chasiv Yar. It should be, I cannot see it on the map, but anyway, I would encourage people just to have a look. There we see Kramatorsk. If you zoom it out like that, then you can see Kramatorsk. So Chasiv Yar is an important place for which the Russians have been fighting for a while. Then we have Pokrovsk there, very good. So the Russians, that is another important logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces. And so what the Russians are doing here is they're trying to go around Pokrovsk, cut off communications and logistical lines of supply for the Ukrainian forces. So they don't want a frontal assault on the city. Rather, they want to take all the important settlements and have fire control over the roads leading to Pokrovsk. So that would be another huge victory for the Russians if they could get Pokrovsk surrounded, as they are doing on a smaller scale now south of Pokrovsk. That would be the Zaporizhia front, the Velika Novosilka. Pardon me.
And just how are the Ukrainians being able to, I don't know, how are they fighting back? Because we've been reporting this on DW as well, and we keep talking about it. We keep talking about these Russian meat grinder assaults, and the Ukrainians outnumbered, and particularly this year, there's really a shortage of troops. How are Ukrainians being able to defend these positions, or are they having to strategically fall back? What's happening there?
Well, some of them will have to strategically fall back, and specifically those in the Pokrovsk direction. I mean, right now, the troops still can be supplied. So the problem here is they cannot just withdraw without getting an order to withdraw. And this is where the next example comes in. So Ukrainian media is talking about Velika Novosilka, saying that it should be considered, the command should consider withdrawal from that settlement. Because at a certain point, for Pokrovsk, it doesn't make any sense as of yet. But for Velika Novosilka, it looks like the Ukrainian contingent is about to be surrounded there, because the Russians came from the northern, so northern eastern part to Velika Novosilka. It's all the way down there. And then they took the villages to the southwest. And so what they're trying to do is to create pincers and control all the roads in, and to control all the roads in, so essentially not leaving much of a choice. And if you're in that situation, then your best bet is to fall back. And that is essentially the idea for Velika Novosilka, and that opens up the whole Zaporizhia front to a certain extent to the Russians, because if we look at Zaporizhia, it's flat. So any settlement which has some sort of elevation has a great importance, because it's easier to defend, you have a good overview. And so that is a reason why the Russians are fighting for these settlements. And with Velika Novosilka, Vuhledar was the first stepping stone to take Vuhledar before you could move to Velika Novosilka, because Vuhledar, Novosilka, Hulai Pole, that was the access that the Ukrainians have used in the counteroffensive in 2023. So the idea of the Russian command is to prevent a potential, however likely it is, a potential counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, because they don't want the Ukrainians to get to the Azov Sea. So they are trying to take control of these smaller settlements, even if it means, even if they don't control the entire Zaporizhia region, those outposts give them a very, very good defensive position. And this is a defensive position that the Ukrainians are using right now. And that's why it's so difficult. And that's why we're talking about a very, very small settlement where people will never find it on a map without zooming in.
And that is what we're trying to do right now.
That is a very important one.
Marina, just stay on the line, because I'd like to bring Tyson in. Tyson, you traveled to Ukraine a number of times, and you were seeing what Marina is saying over there. I just wanted to ask you about this idea of falling back, when the time is right. The Ukrainians haven't been very good at doing that.
Right.
If you look at the experience from the last 2 years, has that evolved, that thinking?
I mean, first of all, just to talk about the character of the conflict right now is that, as you mentioned, meat grinder, it's just a grinding conflict where there is immense resources being devoted and sacrificed disproportionately on the Russian side, one has to say. The sacrifices are much higher on the Russian side. But it hasn't led to immense territorial gains. And even those that have been made, as was just mentioned, are to create a more consolidated defensive position to protect the Azov Sea. So we're still not seeing much movement. We're seeing attrition. And that's what we're going into in this period of, frankly, political uncertainty. And you see this across the board, from the United States to Germany, which is about to go into elections and has put a pause on some additional aid. The United States, the Biden administration had $3.6 billion in defense assistance, security assistance, which is about 8% of the last security package, which it wasn't able to deploy before the administration ended. That's going to fold into the Trump administration. We'll see what happens with that. But there's a lot of political uncertainty, and because of that, that's kind of the overlay on the battlefield itself. So the big question you ask, and I think is made note of, is, let's be honest, Ukraine is, as a population, a smaller country than Russia, and even Russia is having to draw in North Korean troops. So one of the big asks, I think, will be on General Kellogg's first mission to Kyiv, which should be happening in the coming days, is, are they willing to make serious consideration of lowering the conscription age?
And I just want to bring in some comments that have been made so far. Nilay Chaturvedi saying that the longer Ukraine waits, the more it loses its people, not just to war, but also those who have migrated, and such demographic collapse will harm the country. He's also made the point that Ukraine has already been partitioned. Russia has paid an enormous cost and isn't going to give that territory back. He doesn't believe so. And Putin has to justify the war to his people, and he desperately wants to become the first ruler since Stalin to add territory to Russia. So that's some of the comments. There's a question, but maybe we're preempting where we're going to talk to next, but it is something that I'm seeing in chat is a lot of people thinking about what is a fair deal, what would be a fair deal, and that's being asked by Smedley Do Right.
And we are going to be talking about that.
Yeah.
It's coming up. But just on when it comes to on the battlefield, Marina, you were hearing what Tyson was saying there. Given that it's a war of attrition and has been for some time now, I just wanted to get a general sense from you. Has Ukraine's war strategy changed a bit since its, how should one put it, stalled or failed spring offensive of 2023? Has that strategy changed a bit?
Well, let's remind ourselves what happened right after the failed counteroffensive. General Zaluzhny has been removed from command, and General Alexander Syrsky took charge. And there is a completely different approach when it comes to General Syrsky. That being said, we also have to bear in mind is that it's very difficult for Ukraine to strategize, because you are essentially, as a commander of the armed forces, you have two hats. You have a political hat and you have a military hat. So the policy of President Zelensky and his cabinet, they dictate specific end states that they want the armed forces to achieve. And the commander will have to see how the General Syrsky would have to see how exactly can he use the available assets in order to achieve those results that the policy is asking. So the theory goes. Now, we know that Ukraine has a manpower shortage. We know that the morale of the troops has been falling. And we know especially that Western aid has been delayed. There was a huge question mark when it comes to the US aid, and I'm talking about the beginning of 2024. So how can you plan? How can you strategize in those circumstances? How can you mount a counteroffensive if you know that some, let's say, artillery ammunition is coming? 1 million artillery shells were promised to Ukraine by June 24, and they didn't arrive. So imagine you plan your operations according to what you think will be delivered, and it's not getting delivered. Meaning that there is a specific strategic void in terms of what Ukraine can do.
Just on that thought,
what the military can do.
As luck would have it, we do have somebody from the former Biden administration sitting at this very table. Tyson, did you get the impression that the Ukrainians were not being able to plan because timelines that were promised weren't necessarily adhered to?
I do. And that's those are forces that were outside of the Biden administration's control, and to some extent outside the European Union's control. So both in the United States, our $61 billion supplemental, the fifth supplemental, of which about 80% of it was for security assistance for weapons, was delayed by about 8 months. And that put Ukraine on a back footing. And actually, if you look at the timestamp when General Kellogg wrote his peace plan, that was when it looked like that supplemental wouldn't be passed. So there was a really dark moment in March, February of 2024, where there was a lot of uncertainty about future U.S. aid. That ended up coming through. There was also a delay on the European Union side with the so-called 50 billion Ukraine facility. That was 4 months delayed. And that's really hard to plan against for the Ukrainians when they're really relying on these resources, both the financial aid and the weapons to come in. I will say that right now, going into this administration, the Trump administration in 2025, there is a little bit more runway, at least on the economic side, with the 50 billion from Russian sovereign assets, this interest pulled forward. That gives a lot of, let's say, wiggle room, at least on the economic side, to reposition some of the funding that Ukraine has for weapons.
Marina, just back to being on the battlefield, these delays in deliveries, was Russia able to take advantage of these delays? I mean, the reason that I'm asking this is because you would imagine that if they did take advantage of these delays, the battlefield would look very much in Russia's favor.
Well, we don't know that. I mean, in retrospect, nobody from us has been on the battlefield in Ukraine fighting, right? And so it's not, it might sound easy in theory. Well, they are outgunned, they are outnumbered. That means that we can move forward very fast. Well, not so fast. It doesn't mean that. You have to take into account weather, you have to take into account terrain, and of course, what the adversary does. And Ukraine has not been entirely inactive, the Ukrainian armed forces. They have been utilizing drones. They have been using drones for long-range strikes. Then you also have to think about how you design your operations. It means you also need to establish logistics. It doesn't make any sense to get your troops through very fast and take large swaths of territory if you cannot supply the troops securely, if you cannot hold that territory. So it doesn't really mean that if you advance very fast, that you're going to be holding those territories and that you're winning. So let's not get deceived by the fact that, the advances are very slow. And we also cannot say that Russia did or didn't take advantage of the Ukrainian situation. Of course, to a certain extent they did, but we cannot say that this single factor should be the only explanatory variable for Russian advances, because the Russians have also learned. The Russians have also adapted in light of what has been going on. And we have to understand that. And we cannot say, because at the very beginning of this war, the Russians have performed so poorly, we have to judge them by that metric. We have to understand that both sides are evolving constantly and adapting to what is happening. And so we need to keep that in mind when we are assessing a situation. And even now, we don't have an outcome. We don't know how this will evolve.
Right.
We could, for instance, talk about the Kursk operation. Was it a tactical success? Sure. Was it an operational success? Yes. Was it a strategic success? There is a big question mark. Is it then?
It was
because
also a
the Ukrainian
success.
troops are pinned down there.
It was a political success because it injected a great deal of morale. It was a morale boost for the Ukrainian people. And it knocked morale in Russia.
For how long?
Well, it's been going on for 4.5 months, and it continues to play that role.
Well, but
the Russians have not been able to
been going on, but
reoccupy that territory.
Have you talked to the troops in Pokrovsk? Have you talked to the troops in Pokrovsk who have had capable units of holding the Russian advances? Because if you look at it from a military strategic point of view, politically, surely it's a slap to Putin. It has been a slap. But the Russian people didn't rise up. The Russians didn't remove their troops and didn't send them to Kursk to get the Ukrainians out. So from a military perspective, it actually makes sense to pin the capable units in Kursk.
I don't know if the intention with that was necessarily to incite an uprising in Russia. I think that the intention at that point, especially given the difficult situation that was happening in taxation and conscription, was to say, look, we are still a player in this battlefield.
Can I actually bring in something that's happening?
Certainly there are many more audiences to a certain event than just the Ukrainian auditory, meaning that it was also addressed at the Russian audience that Putin cannot ensure territorial sovereignty of Russia. And that was one of the points. And the people in Kursk region, I was asked very often on DW, will there be an uprising of people in Kursk? Will they turn against Putin? So certainly there was a little bit of that back in the minds of the planners of this operation. But now to your point about the morale boost, the troops in Pokrovsk, what did the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk say? What did Alexander Syrsky say a couple of months after the Kursk operation and how it went?
I think your point is very narrowly focused, as you correctly said. This, the troops and its leadership, the military leadership, needs to respond to political signaling. And I think that what you're indicating, and that's probably the truth, is that this was something that Zelensky wanted. But at the same time, it was going into a period where the conscription age was being lowered. which has led to morale struggles because we're talking about troops that are not as well trained as the initial waves of troops. And to demonstrate that this is still a capable fighting force to the Ukrainian people at all levels, including, babushkas, and to demonstrate that Russia is not impervious, including to the babushkas in Russia, actually plays a very important role, including to the United States and to Europe.
Can I just interject a little bit?
Why are we having the problem with the recruitment in Ukraine then, if it boosts morale?
I think
we're just getting a little bit bogged down.
Let's just point well taken, Marina. We'd just like to move it forward.
Yeah, I do want to just integrate what's happening in chat, which is that a lot of people are very focused in terms of morale on the number of people who have died, number of soldiers who have died, and that they've pointed out that there tends to be a focus on what has hurt Russia, but a lot of people are saying, well, not much is mentioned in terms of the number of dead on the Ukrainian side. And frankly, bigger does matter. Bigger is that, Russia has a larger population. So when we're looking at the number of Ukrainians who have died, it's a much larger percentage of the general population. And there are questions about why there isn't any discussion. They would love for both of you guys to sort of weigh in on that aspect of it. And we've also heard, I believe in the last 24 hours, President Trump alluding to the fact that the numbers of Ukrainian dead could be much higher than has been publicly reported, much closer, frankly, to the number of Russian casualties. Tyson, if you could weigh in on that.
I mean, the number of casualties is clearly a tragedy, every single one, both in terms of dead and in terms of other forms of casualties, the wounded. There has been a lot of attention, appropriately so, on how to rehabilitate the wounded and to make sure that veterans get the kind of care they need, both physical and mental, and for the families. This is a fight for Ukraine's existence, and that was a galvanizing force in the early first, let's say, 2 years of the war. But clearly this attrition is a question of will, and it is putting a drag on morale because every single person in Ukraine knows somebody who's been lost. People who went to universities, a lot of the students have left because they've been called up to the front.
Can I just quickly interject? Sorry, just because Marina, I know, needs to leave in the next couple of minutes. So Marina, if you'd like to weigh in on your with some thoughts on this. I do apologize. It's just Marina needs to leave. Marina, please.
Sorry, so just to approach this problem from a different side, if we look at military history, when did every belligerent report correct numbers when it comes to losses? Statistically speaking, usually you normally underreport your own losses and overreport the losses of your adversary. And I think that it's not a coincidence that we do not have an exact number of the losses of Ukrainian troops, and I mean both killed in action and missing in action. The problem here is you already see this problematic situation within Ukraine where people are refusing to be drafted and where specific harsh measures are implemented to get people, to send them to the front. Reporting losses would further, as Taylor correctly said, undermine the morale and also undermine the will, because you basically know that you will be outgunned by the Russians. You don't have the kids that you want to have. Mm-hmm. People who have already been wounded or who have gone missing or who have been killed. And so you do not report those losses. And conversely, the Ukrainians will be probably over-reporting Russian losses, which is also normal, not just in terms of manpower, but also in terms of destroyed equipment and so on and so forth. And this comes down to the issue of how do you count? How do you conduct battle damage assessment? When do you say that somebody has been killed in action? You have to have the body, right? Or how do you know if a piece of military equipment has been damaged or is out of order? And so this is a problem that we're having here. And I don't think we will ever get the actual number, as tragic as it is, the actual statistic, maybe 20 years, 40 years from now.
Maybe there is a number floating around somewhere. But maybe there is a number floating around somewhere. I know you need to go. I think with 1 minute to spare, we're going to thank you very much, Marina, for joining us. We will try and keep your schedule. But thanks very much for sharing some very detailed points that we don't very often get to discuss. We appreciate it. Thank you so much, Marina, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a good one.
Thanks. Back to you, Tyson. Sorry, my apologies for interjecting. You needed to go.
Of course.
So, yeah, please.
Well, I mean, that's an excellent point. You don't want to highlight, the negative. And every loss is a tragedy. And looking at those numbers in that kind of stark detail is probably not something that the Ukrainians want to highlight in this moment. Look, it's the dead of winter right now. The Russians are not only fighting along the front, they've declared war on the Ukrainian economy. There have been 12 waves of attacks on the energy system since March 22nd, 2024. A lot of them are designed, especially right now, to freeze the Ukrainians, to elicit new waves of refugees. So anything that can happen to kind of consolidate morale is going to be something that's done. And definitely that's not, they want to highlight the losses on the other side. The United States has verified some numbers of losses on the Russian side. And I believe in the last numbers that I recall, which is about 6 or 7 months ago, there were around 350,000 casualties on the Russian side. Huge number. And I don't think that the Ukrainian number comes close to that.
Right. I think that the base problem will continue to remain that Russia is a bigger country, Ukraine is a smaller country. There will always be a mismatch, and this thing about reporting will continue to be important. But just for you guys who are just joining in, just so you're aware what we're talking about, we are looking at what the future of the Ukraine war could be under the Donald Trump administration. Remember, he's promised to end the war. The question is, on what terms will it end? What kind of a deal will he be able to elicit out of Russia and Ukraine? Will Europe even be part of the conversation? Some of the questions that we are discussing here on this discussion on News Desk. Normally, we would have a check on the chat, but if it's okay with everybody at the table, I'd really like to bring in the Ukrainian perspective here. And by that, I mean bringing in DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who many of you will know has been reporting on the war from the very first day. In fact, Nick was on a train, I think, heading to the east of Ukraine, if I remember correctly, Nick. And then you had to get off when you heard that the war had been declared. Nick, thanks so much for joining us from Kyiv this evening. I don't know how much of the conversation you got speaking to Tyson there and the conversation we were having at the desk. But can I just ask you at the outset, what is the reaction in Ukraine now that Donald Trump has taken over and there is talk of a peace plan potentially or a deal in the works that is going to take longer than 24 hours? Obviously, what do Ukrainians expect from the Trump administration? Are they worried, or are they cheering, or are they happy that he's there in power?
I think the bottom line is that people here in Ukraine are, for the most part, more optimistic about Trump than lots of people maybe in Europe would have thought. There was considerable frustration with the Biden administration. There was a sense that the Biden administration was just managing this conflict, was more worried about escalation, about bigger conflict with Russia than about actually helping Ukraine to end this, let alone get Ukrainian control back over the territories that Russia has occupied. So there was real kind of growing frustration, a sense that they were being told that these weapons weren't available when actually they were, that they were just also being kind of ignored, especially since Gaza happened. So there was considerable optimism that maybe Trump can kind of pull some unexpected solution out of the bag. Obviously, no one here, particularly believes in his promise to end it all in 24 hours, let alone 100 days. But there is a sense that the adults are still in the room. The kind of more establishment Republicans are in the kind of key foreign policy roles. It's not the kind of MAGA extremists from a Ukrainian perspective who are going to be in charge of foreign policy and defense policy. So there is some optimism. And for now, since he's come into office, there's not been anything that's been particularly shocking or scary. And there's a kind of, I think, cautious optimism that maybe he can, really intimidate the Russian side, really maybe up the pressure on Vladimir Putin and force the Russians to some kind of negotiation.
Nick, and speaking about that, we have a question from the chat asking, how can the U.S. mediate when it has no real leverage on Russia? You might beg to differ. So this is maybe something you want to fact-check almost.
Trump will beg to differ.
I would beg to
Trump
differ.
will beg to differ.
But I'm going to just throw that your way because these are good questions from people who want to learn. And I would love your thoughts on what leverage the U.S. does have.
Well, definitely in terms of economics, right? We've seen that there was a lot of criticism of the sanctions, that they hadn't worked enough, that Russia was still functioning at some level, even though we saw in certain parts of the Russian economy, like aviation, the planes, that embargo on basically parts being an issue very quickly. But the kind of wider economic sanctions have taken some time to really have an impact. But when the Americans started putting more people on, really implementing those sanctions, going after third countries that were doing business with Russia in spite of those sanctions, we are seeing that it is becoming increasingly difficult for Russian companies to deal even with Chinese banks because they just don't want to lose access to the American banking system. We're seeing all kinds of barter trades, right, where India pays for Russian energy with rupees that are unconvertible, that basically are stuck in India, and Russia doesn't have anything it wants to buy with those rupees. So I think there is a level to which just putting more manpower into actually implementing the sanctions, going after all these ways that Russia avoids sanctions. It is very time-consuming. It needs lots of people to chase up all the different kind of companies that are set up just to bring through one or two shipments of spare parts, say, for Russia's weapons production. I think there's a lot that can be done there. I think there's an expectation here that if the US ends up drilling for a lot more oil and gas, more shale gas, and starts exporting more of that energy, that could really push prices down and really hurt Russia in terms of energy prices. There is kind of still quite a lot that people here think a Trump administration can do. And I think we're also seeing that Russia is also kind of has eaten its way through lots of its savings and its kind of security blanket that it had built up in the years before this war. Interest rates there over 20% in Russia, real labour shortages, a real difficulty to kind of keep the technology going. Ukraine's been attacking Russia's oil facilities, and lots of that very kind of highly specialised equipment isn't easy to just get somewhere via Hong Kong through kind of third parties. It normally just comes from the producer, say. So there is real optimism here.
Now, in terms of leverage, here's another question, maybe almost sort of taking a couple of steps back from Thor Veldur. The very first important question is if Trump will continue the U.S. support for Ukraine. And you'd mentioned earlier that Ukrainians were getting quite tired, frustrated with the Biden administration. I don't know if you can answer that. I don't know if any of us can answer that. But what are your thoughts? What do you think? And I would love to, of course, hear what Tyson thinks about that very first question of whether Trump will support Ukraine. Simple as that.
So, we've definitely seen President Zelensky trying to get in Trump's good books. You might remember at the end of last year, after the election, but before his inauguration, there was that meeting between Zelensky and Trump in New York, and they were came to the press, and you had Zelensky looking at Trump's face and kind of Trump saying he has good relations with Ukraine, but also with Russia, and then Trump kind of interrupts and says, well, I hope your relations with us are better than your ties to the Russians.
We can play that soundbite.
Lots of things, trying to message in a way that really kind of,
Nick, I think we can play that soundbite just as a reference for people, and if you wouldn't mind picking up after we've played that soundbite. I think we might have maybe keyed it in by now, and we'll play it any moment. I think it's just worth listening to, and just purely for the awkwardness of it. And I'm just waiting for Dustin, who's in the control room, to try and play that for us.
He didn't play cute. And so I appreciated that. So we have a very good relationship. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it resolved.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have, oh, I see. Yeah, but it takes two to tango, and we're going to have a good meeting today.
Right, so that was the soundbite, Nick. I think it's just worth sort of playing that for everybody listening to this discussion. So, Nick, you were saying, so this personal equation that Trump has with Putin, claiming that that's going to be the key factor in getting a deal across the line, is it?
Well, I think there's a sense here in Ukraine that Trump overestimates the leverage in his kind of personal charisma and his ability just by force of personality to get Putin to move on this, right? Everyone remembers the meeting in 2018 in Helsinki between Trump and Putin during the first Trump presidency, where you had Trump coming out basically afterwards siding with Putin over the US intelligence agency, saying he believed what Putin had told him and not what the FBI had. So there's a worry about that. There's a worry about Trump being with Putin one-on-one. But more broadly, kind of looking at these people, Kellogg, Waltz, other people, Rubio, there is kind of, cautious optimism here. I got the date wrong about the meeting. It turns out it was before the election last year, but that was even before the election, obviously, an attempt to hedge bets and to make sure that all the kind of bad energy, all the kind of bad vibes that had been there, because of that first, the kind of Hunter Biden story, the first impeachment, that was kind of out of the way, and that kind of relations between Trump and Zelensky could be restored.
Tyson?
Yeah, just a couple things. On the leverage side, the sanctions point is exactly accurate. In secondary sanctions on crude, there's still a lot of potential there, especially on enforcement. The Trump administration can go really hard after the shipping, after the intermediaries that are providing that oil to third parties. That is not something that's happened. Very similar to what they tried to do with Nord Stream 2 in the first Trump administration. There's also, they can provide a lot more weapons, and that's something that they've made note of. It's worth noting that General Kellogg said that the decision to provide ATACMS long-range fire and authorize that ability to fire into Russia, this is what General Kellogg said on Fox News, actually provided the incoming Trump administration with more negotiating space, because that could be a leverage, a chit at their disposal, which demonstrates two things. One, there's going to be a good deal of continuity between these administrations in terms of their position towards Ukraine, although, of course, it will be more Trump-inflected. And two, they are seeing this, the provision of weapons either way as being part of that leverage matrix. I think that, the way that Trump and General Kellogg have messaged this is that they are going in good faith to the Russians to see what that response will be. And I think we're all anticipating that the response will be very, very limited in terms of willingness to agree to something that would be palatable for the Ukrainians. And it has to be a just and durable ceasefire that's palatable to the Ukrainian people. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
I just wanted to, if I can just, because you served with the Biden administration, just to understand the logic behind it, you say, and General Kellogg said this, that allowing Ukraine to fire ATACMS into Russian territory was a good decision.
Right.
Why didn't the Biden administration think that earlier in the game? Because they waited for months on end. Ukraine had been asking from the middle of last year, if I'm not wrong,
right,
or even earlier, for that permission. That permission wasn't given. It was only in the winter of last year that permission was given.
Well, I don't know. I would dispute that a little bit, because a lot of what we were responding to in the Biden administration were direct requests and the sequencing of requests from the Ukrainians themselves. And of course, there was a little bit of restriction on that based on the length of time, as mentioned, that it took to get the authorization for the fifth supplemental. So again, we were responding to the requests of the Ukrainians.
Okay. You were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say that another question or a comment from Tabitha Totten. Under a Trump deal, will Ukraine become part of Russia? And I think in some ways, another way to sort of ask the question is that no matter what happens, Ukraine is going to lose territory in this situation that we're facing right now, where things stand.
I think that the scenario that is perhaps best analogous to this would be something akin to the Korean War, or akin to what happened with Germany, where there would be no recognition of any secession of territory, but it would be a consolidated state of play on the ground that allows Ukraine to pursue its destiny in Europe. So continue with the EU accession talks, which have just opened just 2 weeks ago. They've just started to open the chapter negotiations. To have, and this is very important, and maybe we're going to get into the kind of peace negotiations or peace plan, but they've got to provide, and this is one thing the Ukrainians, this is black or white, some kind of security assurance to make sure that the Russians are not just resting and rearming and using this as a time to rebuild and put themselves in a better attack position.
There's two elements there. Do you want to go first? I just have something to bring, and then you can bring that in. Because this idea of a North Korea-like solution with the DMZ potentially, this is something that I believe Vice President J.D. Vance has suggested. He has categorically said no NATO membership. this is something that was part of the Ukrainian victory plan that President Zelensky presented in the Ukrainian parliament. So there has been no talk of any security guarantee, with the exception of General Kelleg providing that to Ukraine. So where will the security guarantee come from, in your view, given, was that the question?
Absolutely. Great minds think alike.
Where is the...
Bart van der Score articulating Buresh's question in chat. What is a security guarantee and what is it really worth?
And given that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 also had security guarantees, that was a tripartite, not tripartite, it contained the US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, four of them, and Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security commitments. I think that was the word, and not guarantee.
Political commitments.
Exactly. So what value, what worth is any security guarantee from who for Ukraine in the future, when in the past something similar didn't work out?
Right. So the Ukrainians are going to go in this very clear-eyed, and this is not going to be a no trust, all verify kind of proposition. That's what they're going to need. You know, the United States, the Biden administration, and Germany and some other states were hesitant to open up formal macro negotiations, although the idea that Ukraine will be a member of NATO and that the relationship is the integrated relationship is intensifying, is there and has been there since the Washington summit. I would say what is most likely is some kind of presence on the ground of European actors that would provide a kind of tripwire. So both personnel, troops from NATO members, and a flood of equipment, including perhaps air defense, to create a kind of porcupine posture, so that the situation in Ukraine is, tantamount to a situation you would have in other basically everything, all allied in everything but name. So they're basically in every way a member of NATO but name. But that's going to require both the United States providing commitments to those European troops and the Europeans being willing to act if the troops are, if that's tested.
Nick, you've been hearing this discussion here.
Can I come in?
Yeah, please. I was going to come to you. What is it that how will the Ukrainians respond to such a proposal? What do the Ukrainians think?
Look, I think anything that is not, NATO membership, or at least, significant numbers of peacekeepers, armed peacekeepers, not the kind of unarmed mission that you had in eastern Ukraine after 2014 under the OSCE, anything short of, a big military Western force is not going to be enough from a Ukrainian perspective. The kind of vision when you talk to people here is that, okay, if somehow this is frozen again, as was the case in 2014, and there is no guarantee, then, as Tyson said there, the Russians come back in a couple of years' time with better planning and better weapons and finish the job. And in the meantime, basically, everyone, who can gets out the country. The men, as soon as the kind of borders are open, join their wives and children in Europe, and this country kind of slowly, basically dies. That's the kind of pretty stark expectation that most people you speak to here have, especially people at the front lines. I was positively surprised by the kind of reaction. I was interviewing people who are at the front lines right now, talking to people who've just come back, and they were willing to kind of give the idea of kind of armed peacekeepers some credence. There is a real hope for that. But, I mean, if you just look at the geography, right, the front line's about 1,000 kilometers long, and then you have Ukraine's border with Belarus and also the rest of the border with Russia, where there isn't fighting currently. So that's going to take tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops, and can Europe really bring that together is another question.
Let's assume for a moment that there is some sort of an agreement between the Europeans, the Americans, and Ukraine about armed peacekeepers. Maybe not across the entire front line, as you mentioned, which is rather vast, but maybe in some areas. What happens if an armed NATO peacekeeper, I don't know, steps on a Russian mine, or if a Russian artillery shell lands on a NATO patrol? Would that mean that NATO would then be at war with Russia? Would there be a risk of that?
If that's to me, I mean, obviously they wouldn't be under the auspices of NATO, right? It would be NATO member states. It would be, France, UK, Germany, whatever. So that's the whole game that's been played since the beginning of this war, right? NATO doesn't send weapons to Ukraine. It may be,
individual states,
helps to coordinate, but it's individual nation states. So I think that's all kind of terra incognita. We don't know where that is going to go and what the risk would be. But obviously, I guess that's part of the game, right? Having that kind of ambiguity for the Russians, so that they have to ask themselves, if we attack this patrol, do we then have to deal with a response from the Germans, from the French? From a Ukrainian perspective, probably they would think that as long as there aren't American troops there, the Russians aren't going to be too concerned. So that is a worry that, without that American kind of presence on the ground, that deterrent becomes less real. If that's all they get, I guess they'll take it. But certainly the Ukrainians are in no mood. That anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum was just recently, and people here are painfully aware of the fact that they gave up those weapons and got so little in return. So I think they're definitely going to play hardball on that.
Tyson, is there any appetite at all, any realistic appetite to send U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine under a president who has made it the cornerstone of his campaign to withdraw American troops from foreign wars and foreign battlefields?
Except he wants to invade Greenland. Let's not forget that.
There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in his speech yesterday, on Monday. But I would say, across the board, and this is a bipartisan position, there's a lot of engagement fatigue in terms of military engagement. That's a hangover from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think even if you listen to the Biden administration, many can dispute the nature of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but he chalks it up to one of his great achievements because it looked like it was just going to go on in perpetuity. So I think that the bar would be extremely high for U.S. troop presence in Ukraine. That said, there are complementary assets that the United States could provide, including flooding the zone, using our defense industrial base, which is obviously the world's largest, to flood the zone with munitions, with high-tech artillery, with Abrams, with Patriots and other equipment, continuing to let Ukraine jump the line in some orders on sophisticated technology, F-16s and other things, to make sure that the European troops and the Ukrainian troops that are on the ground are complemented with the best equipment.
Nick, in Kyiv, President Zelensky made an invitation for NATO membership, one of the key points of this victory plan that he had presented to the Ukrainian parliament. Is he willing to let go of that demand, given that the response, as far as I understand, in European capitals and DC has been less than lukewarm?
I think it's very unlikely that he'll officially say no more NATO membership, we don't want to join. But it's all a question of time, right? Like with the return of territory that Russia has occupied, Ukraine is never going to say that territory, Crimea is now Russia. That's not going to happen. But it's a question of, what do we do actively to get that territory back, and when is that going to happen? Same with NATO membership. Worst case, from a Ukrainian perspective, it stays an aspiration and it's shelved for a while. And in the meantime, Ukraine has these stopgaps. Maybe some kind of bilateral deal with the US, with the Europeans. That is all kind of up for debate. But I don't think the Ukrainians are going to ever officially say we don't want to join NATO. That would also be just playing into the hands of Vladimir Putin, who's made that one of his one of the things he claims are his top priorities to get out of any negotiations. So I think it's very unlikely from a Ukraine perspective that they'll give him that.
I wanted to talk a bit about the role of Europe, but before I do that, I wonder if you, Dustin, in our producer, who's basically running all of this out of sight in the control room. We have a soundbite from President Zelensky. This is something that President Zelensky was talking about at Davos yesterday on Tuesday. And he was talking about EU involvement when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I think it's just worth playing that soundbite and then discussing the role of Europe. And maybe we have all that, we have that keyed up already, and maybe we can play it now.
Right now, it's not clear whether Europe will even have a seat at the table when the war against our country ends. And we see how much influence China has on Russia. And we are deeply grateful to Europe for all the support it's given our country during this war. But will President Trump listen to Europe? Or will he negotiate with Russia and China without Europe? Europe needs to learn how to fully take care of itself so that the world can't afford to ignore it.
Nick, it's not a very complimentary assessment there from President Zelensky. Do the Ukrainians believe, if that is what the president of their country thinks, that European security providers can actually do anything, if at all they are dispatched to Europe, to Ukraine?
Look, I think this wasn't addressed at Ukrainians. This was addressed at people in the room in Davos. This was about telling the Europeans that Ukraine could be part of the solution. We're big on innovation. We've got all these drones. We're flexible in a way that your militaries are not. So having us in the club is actually going to strengthen you, and it's not just going to cost you stuff. Also, there's a sense that President Zelensky kind of doesn't want to be always the person just asking for money and help, but also wants to talk about the bigger European problems and basically talk like he is already a member of the club. And obviously, there's a kind of American audience there. I think that's kind of aimed at the Trump administration, saying that we could also be one of your advocates for the kinds of things you want, like spending 5% of GDP on defence within the club. So if you help us to survive, if you help us to get in all these clubs, then we will play a role that will push Europe in a direction that you're going to like.
Nick, just apropos of what you just said, Mike Gibertse in chat is asking precisely this question, with Trump mentioning that NATO European members should increase their defense spending up to 5%. He is curious how this is being received in Kyiv and also in Russia, and what is Europe going to do or respond about this as well?
Well, Ukraine obviously spends a lot more than 5% of GDP on defense right now, so that number seems pretty harmless seen from Kyiv. You know, we're in a situation here where the government spends all the money it raises in taxes on the military, and everything else, pensions, healthcare, is all paid for by international aid coming in. So the numbers don't surprise anyone here. I'm not sure the Russian public is kind of, the kind of public sphere is following this too closely. But certainly, if you look at kind of the European debates, where even 3% was seen as vast and something that's going to basically cost social spending too dearly, and is going to basically end up in rusty bits of equipment that lots of Europeans think they don't need. Almost doubling this is a pretty big pill to swallow. Let's see where it goes. Maybe this is just an attempt to kind of make 3 look less threatening by demanding 5 and hoping the Europeans get to 3. Maybe there's some gamesmanship there. But certainly we are seeing that the pressure is being upped, and it has worked to an extent, right? We're seeing that European countries are increasing what they spend on defence, but a lot more slowly than others.
Nick, I know you have to leave very soon, therefore I'm just going to make this the last question to you, although we would love to have you on longer, but I know there are special reasons why you need to leave. Can you just give us an assessment, look into your crystal ball and tell us what do you think is going to happen in terms of... I love these kind of questions, and I love throwing them to you because you handle them so well. What can Ukraine expect in the next few months from the Trump administration? Will they get a deal? Will they have to say goodbye to some parts of their country to get some sort of a peace deal or an armistice?
That's just the air raid.
If you need to go, if you need to go, Nick?
I'm good. We're good. We're good.
Okay,
We're good.
right.
We're good for now. I just want to say, I don't think they expect any resolution in a hurry. No one thinks that 100 days is going to be enough. Most people, when you ask them what their kind of gut feeling on this is, they say another year maybe before things are properly wrapped up. Obviously, we could all be wrong, but there is a real sense that Vladimir Putin still thinks he's winning this, still thinks that he can get a lot more on the battlefield, even though the Russian losses are much, much higher than they have been previously. There is a sense that the Trump team will first try out all their kind of personal diplomacy. Trump will try and get that direct meeting with Putin and convince him. And then the hope from a Ukrainian perspective is that, that fails to bring the kind of results that Trump thought he could get, and that then Trump moves to a more kind of pro-Ukrainian perspective. They're already trying their best to kind of get in with the Trump team, speaking the kind of language of Trump, of deals, offering economic opportunities, saying, come invest in Ukraine's rare metals so you don't have to get them from China. So they are, they don't have any other options, they don't have any alternatives, and they're trying to get, as cozy to the Trump team as they can, and hope that, eventually reality means that, Trump comes a bit closer to their kind of view of things than was kind of his position during the campaign.
Nick, I'm getting nervous just to you talking with that air raid siren behind you. Can you get yourself into some cover? Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope we haven't kept you outside longer than necessary. Nick, thanks so much. Find some cover. Be safe. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm just really not comfortable hearing that air raid siren and Nick out
He's
there.
so calm, though, isn't he?
But it
He is
happens
calm.
so often.
It happens so... It's
the thing
regular
that
for him. It's not
people
regular for me, but I really
to
cannot
understand
carry
is
on
that
talking to Nick.
Ukrainians have
But
been
you see
dealing
that
with this
he was
for
inured to it.
years.
I mean, he can tune it out, and that's that's the Ukrainian
life.
experience every
Lots of
day.
people in the chat also concerned for Nick's well-being.
Exactly,
So-
which is why, as much of a great guy as he is and the knowledge that he has, we cannot talk to him while an air raid siren is blaring in the background. But I'm glad that we had him for the time that we did. which brings us to you, Tyson. Listening to what Nick was saying there, how do you think the Americans are going to be approaching this? You were saying that General Kellogg will probably make a trip to Kyiv in the next couple of days, in the next week or something. Are they going to find out some bitter truths that they weren't aware of and know that this is going to take maybe longer than 100 days?
I think there are a couple of steps here. One is this kind of good faith effort to approach both sides. You know, we don't feel like this is necessary, you know, those who've been watching this, but approach both sides in good faith. I think that there will be quickly disabused that Russia is willing to discuss this in good faith. That leaves us with Ukraine as a partner. General Kellogg is going to Ukraine. I think he's going to hear a lot about how to align interests. The question of concessions on critical minerals was mentioned. Ukraine has 32 of the 34 critical minerals that the EU deems as critical. This is an issue that also comes up in President Trump's discussion on Greenland. So the idea that you have the titanium, the lithium, the uranium that is really necessary to power the European and U.S. economy is an area we'll see. And how do we get those concessions for those that have been investing in Ukraine? Dealing with China, I think that's going to play a much bigger role, and the Ukrainians are going to start to anticipate this. How, you know, Marco Rubio on the Hill really said, you know, we're investing in your country, but you're buying Chinese kit in certain areas, in dual-use technology, in mobile network equipment, in other areas. They can't be part of the reconstruction if they're funding your aggressor, if they're funding the adversary. So to see how China is going to play a limited role, because they really are more neutral but inclined towards the Russian side, that's going to be a more important conversation. And just to talk about just generally, what is it in it for us? The U.S., Europe, how is the American taxpayer investment in Ukraine going to yield to dividends for the U.S., for U.S. companies and others? And I think that the Ukrainians are already anticipating this and setting themselves up to have let's say, a compelling package.
We have a question from Diodata in chat, kind of related in terms of resources, but Diodata is curious whether there is a possible connection between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, since they have this commonality of having pro-oil policies. You're nodding your head, so I'll let you.
Well, I mean, you know, Russia has nothing else, really. I mean, it has a defense industrial base that's been juked because they're in a hot war, and that's basically what's been keeping their economy running. Although it's contracting, it contracted last year by about 4%, even while the Ukrainian economy grew by 4%. Just to mention a couple statistics on the Russian economy. I mean, it is overheating. I think that's something that we're aware of. The central bank is panicking. It's hemorrhaging resources. Inflation is 10%. The ruble is valued at less than 1 euro cent. I mean, it's dropped completely. And they've had a massive immigration just like Ukraine has had. So they've lost their best and brightest, both on the front, the meat grinder, and to immigration. So Russia's not in a great place. What does Russia have in a post-war situation? Theoretically, is energy. But because it's been starved of technology, it's become much more expensive to explore and ship that energy. So right now, the United States is well positioned to undercut Russia's global position on the energy front, because for us, for the United States, exploring in shale and oil, opening these up, is really going to be a much cheaper price point on spot markets than Russia has.
Given that that is the situation, do you really think that, you said, to quote you, Russia is not in a good place? That's something that Donald Trump also was saying a few days back. Does that necessarily mean that Vladimir Putin will necessarily make his way to the negotiating table? I mean, the Russians have demonstrated over the past 3 years they can take the pain.
Well, it's an authoritarian country, right? He has the advantage of not having to respond to the will of his people, necessarily. That said, it's going to be greater sacrifice for the Russians because the economic situation is going to continue to deteriorate, either slowly or all at once. It could collapse. And that strain is seen. Nobody is investing in Russia. There's a huge capital flight out of Russia. Nobody will buy Russian assets, not even the Chinese. Everybody wants to get rid of rubles.
So it's a case of who is going to blink first. Can the West hold out and wait for this eventual collapse? Maybe it's exaggerated, but this eventual downfall of the Russian economy, and that would force Putin to come to the table, which would mean that the Americans or the West would need to continue supporting Ukraine. And this carries on longer, and Ukraine keeps losing more people on the battlefield?
Just think about it in these dimensions. So Ukraine is an economy of about $200 billion. The Russian economy is $2 trillion. So it's obviously much larger. But the U.S. economy is $29 trillion. And with the EU, we're talking about over $50 trillion. So as long as it has the backing of the international community, the Western allies, it's sitting on a much larger economic and resource reservoir than the Russians.
Why are we talking about a deal at all?
Because there is a human dimension to this. You know, and I think that comes through even when Trump says this. You know, there's a huge human cost. I think that all sides want this to end. All sides want it to end on their terms, of course, but all sides want this to end.
If it were Kamala Harris coming in as the U.S. president, would there be any pressure on Zelensky to try and push for a deal?
I think it's hard to talk in those terms, but I think that just like now, especially after Kellogg's visit, the United States would be responding to the demand signals from Kyiv.
Right. We'll leave it there for the moment, or unless you have something else to.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking. I'm looking at the comments and questions, and I think that one is going a little bit back to what we've been sort of talking about throughout the conversation. But Carolina asking, so I think this is early on, in the eyes of Ukrainians, are they now siding with Trump? In other words, that they're hoping that with Trump there will be some movement in their direction.
Let me take this question that you asked about Kamala Harris and this question together, if you don't mind, and say, here's the thing that I think people have. Maybe this is overascribed, but I think there's going to be a lot more continuity in U.S. policy towards Ukraine than people necessarily have come into this with. The rhetoric is going to change. It's the Trump administration. We've been through Trump point one. It is a different style, but generally there's going to be a lot more continuity in terms of policy.
We'll leave that there as your final comments, and maybe we can have a look at what the poll results are at the moment. I didn't prepare you for this, but...
No, that's all right. I was prepared for this. Thank you to everyone who voted. So the question we asked you today was, what's the likely outcome of a Trump-negotiated plan for Ukraine? And believe it or not, the same amount of people believe that it will mean a complete end to the conflict, voted also that there'll be no meaningful progress. So 32% believe that there'll be a complete end. 31% believe that there'll be no meaningful progress to this. 23% believe that it will result in a temporary ceasefire, and just 11% believe that there will be an escalation. So interesting
that's
results
a very interesting
today.
result.
Tyson, did you ever get to... How would you vote
How
for
would
that
I
poll?
voted?
Yeah.
You know, so there's a poll that just came out from the American Chamber of Commerce in Kyiv, the largest chamber of commerce in Europe. It has 600 U.S. companies and has grown. 16 more companies joined this past year. And, you know, 66%, this just came out on Inauguration Day, 66% of American companies invested in Ukraine think that there'll be a ceasefire this year.
All right. There you go.
Well, I mean, that's something that tilts the poll in a particular direction.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Tyson.
Thanks so much, not just you, Tyson, but Alex, for all that context that you brought in. Jared, thanks very much for monitoring the chat. I thought there were some very interesting comments that were coming in. I was trying to read them while we were chatting. We couldn't bring everything in, but then it's certainly a subject that people have lots of opinions on.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to organize all the comments and questions because we want like a natural flow, and then Nick might be talking about something, or Tyson, that's not quite directally related. So we're always trying to time things.
And it's also not the last time we'll be talking about Ukraine, right? And Tyson, you're around now. So
I'm around. Here I am.
You'll be coming into the. It was really we're very happy. I personally am that we got to hear those perspectives. We haven't had that depth of perspective in a long time, and now we have a new administration. New perspectives are always welcome. Anyhow, I'm prolonging this. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll be back again next week.
And next week, if you want to know what topic that's going to be, of course, always go on YouTube to that community tab about 24 hours before this stream, and you'll find out the topic.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Maybe we're talking about Ukraine. Who knows? Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.